Hello and welcome back, and a very, very happy, healthy new year to everyone. I'm James Harding. I'm the editor and founder of Tortoise. And if you've never been to a Thinking before, if someone as a Christmas present gave you a Tortoise membership, a hearty welcome. When we set up Tortoise, Katie Vanek-Smith, Matthew Bars and I had this thought, which was, above all, we'd want a newsroom that was welcoming. And that's not a word that most people associate with journalism or news generally, but we really did want that. And we wish that we were starting the new year back in our newsroom. We're not. We're still on a screen, and we're probably going to be that way through the month of January. But we really hope that doesn't deter us from doing what this thinking, like all our thinking, is intended to do. A, help us come to some really good ideas for stories, and it's the beginning of the news year and we're in the market for any thoughts you've got. And B, come to a better informed point of view about the things that are in the news. I'm going to today just sort of, if you like, pick up on a couple of loose ends before we get into some of the more obvious subjects, i.e., do we want to talk a bit about COVID? Do we want to talk about the politics of inflation? Do we want to talk about democracy's testy year ahead? Or do we want to talk about anything else that's on your mind? But I think that there are a couple of long-running investigations that we've put out, Sweet Bobby at the close of 2021, and Basher Cummings's Coolsculpting this week, and the Griffiths versus Griffith story that we're planning for next week. And I just thought it might be useful, if we can, just to start there. I want to just make sure that everyone knows and understands exactly, or I hope understands exactly, how a thinking works. If you have something to say, do just put your hand up, a digital hand up, or kind of add something in the chat. And if you'll allow me 1 minute just to do a little riff on how we see ourselves this year, I think that one of the frustrating elements of COVID has been the extent to which the news has felt more repetitive than ever. Either it's hospitalization numbers or infection numbers or isolation numbers, a barrage of that data, a much more domestic politics-based news than perhaps everyone might have wanted, either too domestic, missing out on what's happening in the rest of the world, or too politics-based and missing out on what's happening in society. And when we set up Tortoise, as you'll know, we tried to get after a news agenda that would be slow, open, and interested in what happens next. And I hope that what you'll see is in our investigations, we come good on that. Slow in terms of the time we take, open in terms of an openness to people, but also to ideas, and that we do stick with particular stories. I hope that Basher's here. Let me just double check whether she's here, because I might start with her. If not, I'm just going to come to Giles first on how he sees the year. Basher, if you're not here, I'm going to come to you in a second. But Giles, do you want to just kick off, because you rather deliberately hit the start of the year with a determined position, i.e., let's not have false, upbeat, pointless positivity. What's your read on how 2022 begins?
Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you perfectly.
Okay, great. It begins in a bit of a trough. I speak not as a patriot, that's a whole nother matter, but as a Democrat. And yeah, journalistically, was it yesterday's sense maker was deliberately downbeat, just because I think that there are times when, and I'm sorry to sound pompous, if journalism has a duty, it is to, it's not to cheer people up, nor is it to cherry pick the bad news, but it is to call it out as bad news, and to use the sort of privileged observer position to stand back and try to judge whether things really are looking grim over a longer time span. And I remember, let me confess, I'm somewhat preoccupied with the next 2 years of American politics, but they surely have more than a ripple, a big knock-on effect on the rest of the democratic world. And I remember when Reagan was seen as a buffoon, Clinton, some years afterwards, got in, and you'll help me with the name, James, of the fairly celebrated British commentator who was then with the BBC. I'm blanking on him. Anyway, he did a road trip from Hope, Arkansas to Washington, quoting Clinton, "I'll always believe in a place called Hope," and ending up with a resounding expression of faith in American democracy. And it's the country's ability to reinvent itself, get back on its feet, recover from crises, from the Vietnam War, from Watergate. And I can't help thinking, first of all, that he was right, that America had those strengths, but also that to a large extent, for 2 generations, they were strong strengths because America had defined itself in opposition to Soviet communism. That disappeared with amazing rapidity in 1991. And I think we're still, and the US broadly botched its response to where a Marshall Plan was needed to rebuild the Soviet Union in 91. There was shock therapy instead. I think the Putin poison is a direct result of that. And we're dealing with the long-term effects of that now. And I think they could be extremely serious for American democracy. I do think at the moment there's some pretty hysterical reporting going on about, time to coincide with the anniversary of January the 6th. I think it's far too soon to call time on American democracy. But as we mentioned in a meeting yesterday, if you zero in from that that longer term perspective to the now and the emergency that the Democratic Party faces, I think it's very acute. You could just see it as a 2022 problem of a very old incumbent without an obviously suitable successor in his vice president, without any obviously compelling candidates elsewhere in the Democratic Party, although John Ossoff might be one at the ripe old age of 34. And Trump on the other side, as Barton Gellman notes in his recent 14,000 word cover story for the Atlantic, holding the Republican Party in thrall, and really the nomination, if not the general election for 2024, is his to lose. I think that's an extremely serious situation for America and the world. That's why I was grumpy when I went to bed on Monday night and when I woke up Tuesday morning. As mentioned, there are also other somewhat genuinely depressing themes for the year, including fumbling of this gigantic public health emergency and the failure to help vaccinate low-income countries, which Tortoise has reported on repeatedly. Climate, the extent to which the world can follow up on the fine words of COP26. And there was a fourth thing, which I forget, but I'm sure you'll remind me.
Possibly energy prices, inflation, and the cost of living crisis that's coming.
Yes, but on that, the reason I haven't included that in my little roundup, James, is that at your behest, I sort of did some asking around last year, and your view on inflation is obviously more informed than mine. and very legit, but rather less widely shared than I thought it might be.
It is. I'm going to. I tell you what I'm going to try and do in the next 50 minutes, if we can, Charles, is pick up on those themes and a bit the tone. It feels like we start the year with some genuine COVID questions. I want, if I can, to come to Matt Dancona and just get a sense from Matt on where Boris Johnson's number 10 is, both in terms of the hangover from Partygate at the end of the year, but also on the sort of postponement of decisions around any further social distancing. I'd like to then, if I might, just tip on a little further to this question of vaccine inequality and the arms race. And I know, I hope Lara's spirit's here and might talk a little about that, because we're thinking about how we address that. I do think that, Giles, I suspect we're going to come back to quite a lot more foreign policy in 2022 than we did in 2021, that there's going to be quite a lot more around what's happening elsewhere, either flashpoints, Iran, Sudan, Taiwan, or around, tests on democracy, US and midterms, but also Brazil, France, Kenya, etc. So I'd like to do that, but just to remind people, this hour is intended to be driven by things that you think we should be thinking about. So please just message me either privately or in that whole chat, and I'd love to hear what people think. I just see Alison has made this point about borders and immigration, and it does seem amazing. I see Dave Taylor's here. It does seem amazing that we started last year talking about crossings of the Channel, and actually what seemed extraordinary at the end of 2020 turns out to be only a glimpse of things to come in 2021. So it's certainly worth coming back to that. But Matt, can I start with you?
Hi there.
Health. The health of Boris Johnson's government and Boris Johnson's government handling of health.
Yes, discuss. Well, I think that just watching Bob Johnson in the Commons earlier today, it's very clear that he is in a position that you would not have predicted when he won a hefty majority in 2019, which is that he is, though he has a 79-seat majority, he is captive now to his party, which has reinvented there's always a rebellious part of the Tory party. This seems to be part of its kind of DNA, and the rebellion is now, having previously been around Brexit, it's now reorganized itself around libertarianism. And what was rather sort of extraordinary to watch was how deferential Johnson was to Mark Harper and Steve Baker, the leaders of that particular faction in the debate today. So it was a very strange spectacle, because you had a prime minister saying, on the one hand, 1 in 15 Britons had COVID last week, but on the other, he wasn't going to do anything more to restrict their movements. Far from it. We were winning the battle against Omicron, and as far as he could see, there was no need to extend Plan B, the restrictions we presently have, beyond January 26th, as the plan currently holds, and that it might be possible between now and the 26th to relax some of them. And it's certainly the case that hospitalizations are not surging as was initially feared. The rates of transmission are extremely high, around the 200,000 a day mark. Not all of those cases by any means are serious, but Omicron has proved to be a spectacularly transmissible variant. Now, as to the politics of all this, well, there's no question that Johnson has been very seriously damaged by the various scandals before Christmas, the Owen Paterson fiasco, the row over how he paid for his wallpaper, which I think leads into an interesting question about, more generally, about his personal finances, and of course all the parties, which I think were both pathetic in the sense that it was extraordinary to have a government judged by such a trivial metric, and yet one that really enraged people, because it was all about hypocrisy. It was all about the idea that there was one rule for this government that had come in claiming to be against elites and was now behaving like the most self-indulgent form of oligarchy you can possibly imagine. And the problem Johnson has is that he is just showbiz. And so, as in showbiz, once people go off a performer, they go off them permanently. So there's a deeper volatility in his brand than there is in the brand of most prime ministers. I think
Matt, can I just ask you one thing just about that? Is that I don't know whether you saw Danny Finkelstein wrote this piece just before Christmas, which was, it's not that they won't do him in, the Tories, but historically, it's much harder to push out a prime minister than we think. And so a lot of the speculation about how vulnerable it is. But I just wondered, is there a relationship between, if you like, unfinished business around hypocrisy, these questions around him, the way he and Carrie have behaved, and the continuing questions about exactly parties and checkers and international travel and all of those things in 2020, 2021. So the sort of hypocrisy element of this, and the point you make about libertarianism and the flank that he's open on the right of his party that's not very comfortable with a kind of big government conservatism. Do the Mark Harpers and the Steve Bakers have any appetite to push him out?
Well, the deepest irony of all is that one of his few remaining allies is COVID, because though it nearly killed him and it has become a thorn in his side as someone who had grand ambitions to change the infrastructure of this country and still wants to level us all up, whatever that turns out to mean, it's actually the fact that COVID continues to lead the news bulletins that makes it hard for any form of rebel faction to coalesce into a genuine attempt to bring him down. So although Liz Truss, the Foreign Secretary, and Rishi Sunak are undoubtedly on manoeuvres, undoubtedly drawing up lists of potential supporters, neither of them will move. Neither of the sharks circling in the tank will take a bite out of Johnson until the pandemic is third or fourth in the run of news stories, because even the Tory party at its craziest doesn't depose a sitting prime minister during a public health crisis. I mean, that really would be a recipe for electoral disaster. I think you're right that there is a serious philosophical split now in the Conservative Party between those who are sort of accidentally led by Boris Johnson, who wants to spend and borrow lots of money to pay for, primarily in his case, infrastructural projects he likes, as we know, bridges and airports and tunnels and stuff like that. And those who find their representative in the cabinet, principally in Rishi Sunak, who still cling to the Thatcherite ideas of deregulation, low tax, giving everything out to the private sector, reducing the scale of the state. This remains very fundamentally in the kind of bones of the Tory party. It's totally irrelevant to the politics of the 2020s. I mean, that's the problem they have, is that they feel all this very deeply. But if you look at the problems that are going to be facing a government any government in the Western world in the 2020s, the idea of reducing the size of the state is hilariously irrelevant.
So Matt, I'm just going to pause before we get on to kind of global vaccines and the arms race stuff you've done, because I just want to take the temperature on Johnson's handling of Omicron and the sort of what's felt like a fortnight of postponement on decisions, and then a return, if you like, or a restatement of Plan B. I'm interested to know what people think of this. I mean, Liz, we haven't talked about this. I'm not quite sure. Are you sort of happy enough with where things have landed in terms of not going back to a lockdown, but just worried that we're just going to be on an endless vaccine treadmill?
Yes, I think so. I think I don't know what, James. There's been so many iterations of this that I almost don't know anymore. I almost don't know if you implemented a sort of more robust version of Plan B or Plan C or whatever it would be, whether there is data that suggests that would help or hinder. I almost can't tell anymore. The reason why I asked the question about vaccination is because I sat next to, on New Year's Eve, a GP. She sort of sits on various sort of oversight boards. She's quite a senior person, has a public profile, and she was just saying that it is just impossible for her to operate, and she can't see how it's ever going to be any different from the brief that she received, which is you just have to vaccinate and forget everything else. And she can't sort of see when that's ever going to stop, because the first people that she boosted are now calling up and saying, I'm worried that I've done it's however many weeks it is, and now I'm scared again, and I'm just staying at home, and can I come and have another one? And I just don't have any sense of a pathway in this country, in England, beyond about 4 weeks ahead. I don't have any sense of when it's going to be any different ever. I don't know.
I'm just going to ask a few other people what they think about this. Lara, I want to play you in around the whole kind of global vaccine inequality thing in a moment. But can I just ask you a very unfair question, which is, in the conversation we've had with the WHO around all the arms race stuff, is there any reason to buy the theory that you are going to see more and more variants in 2022, but that the pattern of Omicron will continue, i.e. more infectious, but not necessarily more virulent, in fact, less virulent? Or is it possible that the worst of all worlds happens, which is you get Omicron infection levels, but something that's much higher mortality level?
Yeah, I mean, that's it is possible that, as far as I understand it, that you could still get a worse variant. And I think in the conversations that we've had with WHO and also with Matt, it should be quite clear to us that Omicron means we've actually got quite lucky in the sense that the severity is less. But there is absolutely no guarantee that new variants won't be more severe, as well as being incredibly transmissible. And I think we've had quite an interesting discussion in the chat. I can see Zav asking this question around treatments versus vaccines, antivirals versus vaccines, which I think is going to be a really hot debate this year, because it seems as though from the outset, now that Pfizer and Merck have both had this agreement to enter a patent pool with their antiviral, which is phenomenally successful at reducing deaths and hospitalizations in symptomatic COVID patients if taken early, much cheaper, much more easier to transport and to administer. There is this argument that that people who are advocating for vaccines are going to have to answer, which is, well, why don't we just focus on treatments? Why focus on vaccines? The answer to that, I think, is that by March, the G7 will still have a surplus of 1.4 billion, even with what some people here will consider excessive booster campaigns. So I think the real answer is that you do both. And even if we're doing both, we're still up against a race, and it's still very, very possible into 2022 that we could have another new, more severe and, as you say, more transmissible variant. And Gordon Brown wrote very eloquently about this in The Guardian before Christmas, when he said that we could see another 5 million more deaths. So this idea, I think it's very tempting at the beginning of January to be optimistic and to think that perhaps the worst of this is over and that we're emerging, because in the UK we're fortunate enough to feel in some sense that we are. But unfortunately, that's really not the case, and this is far from over. The most optimistic suggestions on global vaccination look well into 2023 to be able to vaccinate people. And one stat, sorry to ramble on, but one stat that I saw today really shocked me more than, I mean, we look at many shocking stats on this because the failure in the intellectual community is just so bad. But one stat I saw today was that in the final 6 weeks or few weeks of 2021, Africa, the UK, Europe and the US received the same number of doses as Africa received in the whole of 2021, so 500 million. So Africa has only received 500 million doses this entire pandemic, which is absolutely shocking. And you just think we've administered over 130 million in the UK alone. So there is such a vast gulf, which even with increasing supply, so over 19 billion or something doses produced by the middle of this year, we still seem to be a really long way off protecting some of the most vulnerable people. And unfortunately, yeah, as you say, no guarantee that in light of that, we're not going to get a more dangerous variant.
I'm going to come back to that if I might in a second, but I just want to know, Zav, what do you think? Do you think we're slightly missing the story here, which is that this is going to be a year for treatments, and so prices and distribution of that is the story?
I'm not entirely sure, to be honest. I mean, I think we're maybe underestimating how much the variant possibly changes what our thinking should be in terms of getting vaccines out, because Lara's right, of course, that by leaving countries partially or almost fully unvaccinated, you run the risk of more variants being created. And that is an argument for vaccinating said country. I think on the other hand, you can see, I think as Liz hinted at, this kind of interminable situation where we really get our act together on a particular vaccine. We really roll it out to all these countries that need it. And then 3 months later, a different variant emerges where that vaccine suddenly isn't effective. I don't know off the top of my head whether treatments are more kind of cross-protective across variants and kind of hold up better. But I think given we're now in a situation where to get the really good effectiveness against severe disease, you need 3 doses of a vaccine. And it may be that in time that vaccine becomes not effective and you have to do the process all over again. I think the kind of long-term thinking has to be a bit different to just get vaccines into arms. I know Fauci a few days ago, I think he said that in 18 months, there will be hopefully be a cross-protective vaccine, which I think will protect against even symptomatic COVID in theory. So short of severe disease, symptomatic COVID across variants which have already emerged and may emerge in future. I think that will be a really important moment in terms of getting the world vaccinated. But I mean, I think like Liz, it's hard to see that far ahead if in a month's time we've suddenly magically got all these vaccines out to people and then in 3 months' time a new variant emerges, which means we have to do it all over again. You hope that you do at one stage hope that we get to a herd immunity stage, I think, where hopefully the disease is weakened enough and infects enough people that it becomes less of a problem that way. But maybe that's a bit too pessimistic.
I will, Zav, thank you. By the way, Philip P, who's very lively in the chat, if you stick your camera on, I'll bring you in because I'd love to hear what you have to say. And by the way, I should just say something, which is, although we're starting on a very, I was going to say gloomy, but realistic note about the state of the world, it's really lovely to see a bunch of people back in this digital thinking. So welcome back and a happy new year. I'm going to take, if I might, a quick commercial break, if you like, i.e. just to talk about some of the stories that we've done. I wanted to just check in with Kerry because if you had followed Sweet Bobby and you've had a chance to listen to Coolsculpting, you'll see what we're trying to do in terms of narrative investigations. And Kerry, I just wonder whether you could just fill us in on what's happened in terms of those stories and what we've got coming up.
All right, so well, let me do them in kind of chronological order. So Sweet Bobby first. Those of you who haven't heard it, story about sort of online deception, a huge, long-running online deception of a poor woman who was deceived for 10 years into believing somebody was her boyfriend online when he wasn't. I mean, it's been a kind of, it's our first sort of foray into the sort of global podcast mega hits territory. It's for the last 6 weeks, it's been downloaded at a rate of about once a second, 24 hours a day around the world. So, and I gave a little quiz to some Tortoise people yesterday about the countries where it hasn't yet been downloaded. And the only countries we could find where Sweet Bobby hasn't yet been downloaded were Suriname, French Guiana, Chad, the DCR, and Turkmenistan. Everywhere else, someone has had a listen. So it's, and it has provoked a debate, I think, that we hoped it would cause, which is really to do with the criminality of the kind of behavior that Kirat, the woman at the heart of it, had to go through. So should it be considered an aspect of coercive control, as it would be if it was in a physical setting? Does the law need to catch up with the sort of realities of the online world? And it was interesting to see someone like Joshua Rosenberg starting to ruminate about that yesterday. Is there a case now for Parliament trying to learn the lessons of Sweet Bobby and catch up with the 21st century. So that's that, I think I say that's going brilliantly, and it's kind of in public policy terms, it's doing what we hoped it would do. And then
and Karen, just before we go any further, because it's quite interesting witnessing. I don't know whether people saw Ben Smith, the New York Times media correspondent, and Justin Smith, who are not related but was essentially the business side of Bloomberg, and sort of announced or stumbled into announcing that they were going to go off and set up a new news business. And with lots of the language that we had, and it actually made me feel, believe it or not, even for a young startup, slightly wistful, in that when you start, you're trying to figure out how do you do journalism differently, given how frustrated people are with the news. I'm just interested to know what your reflections are on what we've actually learned about storytelling, commissioning of stories, process, and how that will affect what you think we do in the next year.
Okay, how long have you got? So I think we've learned some old lessons. So we had that podcast we did before Christmas. So we've learnt that old-fashioned narrative virtues still matter, and I think one of the reasons I find that fascinating is because we don't have in this country a sort of long established narrative tradition like you have in the States. So a lot of the stuff that we're learning, I think, comes from This American Life, you can go back to sort of Garrison Keillor on the radio way back when, and beyond that, and also look at the sort of the magazines they've had over there where there's been a tradition of long form narrative storytelling. We haven't had a lot of that in this country, and so it does feel like we're trying to invent something here, or reinvent something that hasn't been kind of front of mind in British journalism for a long time, which is exciting. And the reason I mention that is I think because one of the things I think the Smiths, whatever their product turns out to be, have said that we wouldn't have said, is that they're explicitly going for a university-educated, English-speaking global audience. And I think one of the Sweet Bobby lessons is that if you get the storytelling right, you probably don't need to dwell on the university-educated thing as much as they have. There's an audience there that will respond to great storytelling that doesn't have to have a kind of degree level approach to, or whatever that is these days. So I think it's, for me, the narrative approach has been a way to open up our journalism to new audiences. We've got to find the kind of the marriage between the seriousness of what we want to do, the sort of public policy outcomes we want to push for, and the kind of stories that people are interested in. But I think something that all of those things are present in Sweet Bobby, so it's a great place to have started to try to figure out what the power and the reach and the kind of consequences of good narrative journalism can be.
And then, so with that in mind, do you want to talk through Coolsculpting this week and Griffiths next?
Yeah, so Coolsculpting, so Basha, who would be here if she wasn't laid low with COVID. So Basha has done this rather brilliantly. She started getting interested in Coolsculpting, which is a cosmetic technique that advertised itself as a way to get rid of body fat without invasive surgery. So it was basically pitched as a kind of cheat. You didn't have to, it wasn't liposuction, you didn't need to stick something in yourself, you didn't need to have anything cut out. This was a way to freeze fat and for it to just naturally drain away. And it was sold as this kind of, the next great thing, the replacement for liposuction in effect. And what Basha discovered, was that actually the reported rates at which it goes wrong are potentially dramatically higher than they've been advertised. that dream of a kind of shortcut to getting rid of body fat is still a dream. That there are big downsides to for some people to Coolsculpting, which which have profound consequences for them, and that the market for this stuff is unbelievably huge. So among a number of things that shocked me in her reporting was that the scale. She goes through some of the takeovers of the companies that have been involved in developing Coolsculpting, the process to where it is now, and the billions that are involved in this market are just a real eye opener. But I think you were struck by some other things, James, as well about it.
I do. The reason I just wanted to sort of flag it up to people is that I think it raises quite an honest set of problems for us in how you do investigative stories where the story doesn't end once, if you like, you've got as far as you can go. So if you look at what's interesting in what happened, and for those people who haven't had to listen to it, this is in effect the Linda Evangelista story. Do you remember she emerged last year having had this really traumatic time with a set of cosmetic surgeries? I mean, traumatic is an understatement. What emerges is that as Basha gets greater clarity on quite how many people have been affected by this so-called PAH, is that it could be that it's not 400 out of the 8 million people who've undertaken this procedure, or 4,000, but more like 57,000 people. And that then raises a whole bunch of questions for the company that provides this service and the company that now owns that business. And I think I just flag this up to us, i.e. all of our Tortoise colleagues and members. We're going to have to think about how we stick with stories beyond the moment that we go out and publish and broadcast them, and how we keep coming back. And I just sort of think that's kind of on my mind / on my conscience at the start of the year. Kerry, before I'm quite finished with you, do you want to just flag up for those people who weren't around just before Christmas? We at Tortoise had been pursuing the case through the courts for quite a long period of time that had been run by Basha and Louise Tickle. It was the Griffiths case, and we're going to try and report that out fully next week. But do you want to just give people a flavour or a sense of what that's about?
Yeah, just quickly. So the case, I mean, I think, James, you've had a long-standing interest in the family courts. I have too, back when I was in the BBC. And part of the reason for taking an interest in this case and helping to fund the legal action that led to the ruling before Christmas was that this was a case that normally would have been private, in secret. We'd never have known about it. It involved 2 MPs, the former minister Andrew Griffiths and his wife Kate Griffiths, and through a family court judgment over which was to do with access to their children, which is why normally this thing would have been secret. A judgment was reached in that case on the civil burden of proof, so balance of probabilities not beyond reasonable doubt. But the judge in the case decided on that balance that Andrew Griffiths had been guilty of the rape and sexual abuse of his wife, Kate, who took over his seat in Burton-on-Trent after he was forced to resign. The reason we felt it was worth funding through the courts, we had to basically go down the back of every sofa in the whole of Tortoise to find the money to do that, was because Andrew Griffiths had been a reasonably prominent member of the Conservative Party. He had been involved in framing, not just voting on, but framing legislation to do with sexual abuse and domestic violence. And it felt important that his personal behaviour should be revealed through this judgment. So we funded that case, and the judge came down on our side. It went to appeal, and the appeal also came out in our favour. But it's a way, I think it's part of a long process of beginning to open up the family courts to further scrutiny, as well as that sort of long-standing belief that people in public life, particularly when they're voting in the ways that Andrew Griffiths voted on legislation that is relevant to this case, should also be seen and noted in public as well.
Kerry, thanks. And I just flag it up because I invite people to listen to it, and perhaps we can come back and discuss it next week. It feels as though there have been some very, very high-profile arguments about rights to publish and privacy. This was one where it felt as though there were a whole bunch of arguments, and it wasn't just about politics and power and public life, but also around the way in which we understand conduct that goes largely unseen. And this is a way of having that conversation too. So please do have a listen. I think there is a really important debate about how journalism, how newsrooms do interact with the courts, but how newsrooms too can be an agent of progress. So yeah, do have a listen, and we'll pick it up next week. I said that I'd come back to a bunch of people. Firstly, I said I would come back to Philip, who has just made a run of points, and we went, Philip, frankly, through the whole gamut. Johnson and the NHS and COVID and energy prices. You were there. Tell us what's most on your mind, and if you had a newsroom at your disposal, which I think you should assume you do, where you direct us.
Hello, thank you. My name's Philip Pearson. I'm a respiratory consultant in Northampton, and I suppose it's worth saying, standard disclaimer: all views are my own, not the views of my employer, and I'm not here to provide medical advice, etc. Things that are bothering me at the moment. I am a respiratory physician, so I've been right in the middle of this for the last 2 years. I still think it's too early to say whether Omicron is a quote unquote milder variant or not. The case numbers have risen dramatically. The admission numbers are now rising. And I think we will find out within the next 2 to 3 weeks, as those people who have now been admitted, whether they need the kind of advanced respiratory support that we've needed to give patients over the last 20 months. Other things that we've been talking about this evening.
Can I just Philip, just on that,
sure.
Is what do you make of the kind of conversation that Lawrence and I were having about moving away from this quite such a reliance on vaccines and to treatments? Is there anything you're seeing in terms of treatments that gives you much confidence?
We have advanced hugely in terms of the treatment regime that we give patients, and some of those treatments, like dexamethasone, have the cost of pence, which is completely ridiculous for a new treatment for a new disease. What we are giving in terms of treatment for the people who are admitted to hospital, for those who are then requiring oxygen or other ventilatory support, those treatment regimes are developing as we speak. I was last looking after the respiratory ward a couple of weeks ago. I'll be looking after it again next week. In that 3 to 4 weeks, it is likely that how we treat patients will have been tweaked slightly. So we are making progress. In terms of, is it going to be, are we going to just require an occasional vaccination? Is this all going to peter out? I think it very much depends on the virulence of the variants that are coming down the line. It may all just peter out, and that there will then be enough immunity in the population that yes, you get COVID, but it isn't too bad, and you don't need to come into hospital. The problem is how often we get the severe variants.
And is this this point that I was fumbling in terms of asking Lara, there seems to be this kind of people like me, i.e. your average amateur epidemiologists now saying, oh, well, this is the pattern. Viruses tend to become less virulent even if they become more infectious. Is that a bankable assumption?
It is generally true. As far as I'm aware, it is generally true. But there are shifts in, for example, shifts and drifts in, for example, the influenza virus, so that every few years there's a drift and a little spike, and every 40-ish years there's a genetic shift, and it's only the people who've been exposed to that particular variant 40 years ago who have any kind of immunity. So the last one was H5N1 a few years ago, and a lot of people got very ill very quickly because they did not have immunity to that particular flu virus. I can't tell at the moment how this is going to pan out. I will say that the pattern of COVID thus far, with an initial spike in spring, a huge spike last winter, and a spike from the autumn into this winter, pretty much matches the pandemic flu of 1918-19. And it's also worth saying, as we're having a really cheery New Year episode, we haven't actually had a proper pandemic flu for about 50 years, so we're overdue one.
Philip, I'm glad I came to you. Just to give you a sense of where we're going, if you think this is grim, tomorrow evening we've got Ray Dalio joining us, who's one of the kind of most successful investment managers ever, but also now profoundly worried about capitalism and the prospects of a civil war. And I called him this evening just to prepare for tomorrow evening's conversation. We ended that call on a worrying note, which is, would there be civil war in the United States because in 2024 neither party would accept the outcome of the election? So just to tee everything up for tomorrow, you may not be the last, Philip, that has got a worrying note for us. I want to do, if I can, Karen Key posted a note. This is, forgive me for jumping around, but Karen, you posted a note about something we haven't really talked about, and I don't know whether you're there and able to talk about, which is this thing that did really interest me as we got to the end of Sweet Bobby, which was about closed communities controlling communities and patterns of behavior within them. And you raised some things that I know a little bit about and some I don't know anything at all about. Where do you think you'd see similar kinds of things?
So it's really interesting. On the podcast that I co-host, we did an interview. It's called Our Dream Deferred. It's an American podcast, and we try to look at the forces that shape and distort American culture and sort of how we got where we are. We interviewed a philosopher named T. Nguyen, who writes about echo chambers and makes the point that an echo chamber is very similar in structure to a cult. And there's a lot of work in the US as well around looking at the intersection of these high demand religions and this sort of cult-like manipulation, sort of coercive control.
And you also, but then you also referred to something, sorry, which I don't know about, which is was it called Nexium? Oh, sorry, I suddenly can't hear you. No, come back. Oh, don't. Try again. Sorry, Karen. There's some high control piece of technology here that's getting in our way. But
can you hear me now?
Oh, yes, I can. Yes. Come back.
Okay, great. Okay. Nexium is there was a documentary called The Vow that's very popular on Netflix about this. It was basically a business that was sort of a self-improvement. It appeared to be a self-improvement movement that really was another cult, with Keith Raniere is the name of the cult leader in that case, and he was causing women to be physically branded. It's a very disturbing story. He's now in prison. So there's a lot of work going on between looking at a business like Nexium, some of the multi-level marketing companies that really draw people in and they kind of act against their own interest because they're caught up in the culture of the that sort of multi-level marketing scheme.
And then, just for example, Karen, what's an example of that? Forgive me, I should know all these things, but like
of the companies.
Yes.
So there's a company called LuLaRoe that was a big company that had made leggings and other women's clothes. And again, that was really a scheme where, you know, most of those multi-level marketing companies, very few people make money, but it becomes almost cult-like in the way that people get caught up in it. In that case, it's almost always women, mostly stay-at-home moms. So there's also an interesting podcast called Conspirituality that looks at sort of the intersection of conspiracy theory and the yoga and alternative health movements, just to say that there's a lot happening with people sort of being caught up in any system that gives you all the answers, that it sort of simplifies your thinking process so that you feel that comfortable feeling that you have all the answers. And that's what a company can do. It's what a religion can do. It's what a cult can do. And it's what a person like Bobby, the Bobby character, how you can manipulate someone, and social media being a powerful force in this as well, to kind of surrender the very high intelligence of the woman who was being manipulated by, Kirat is just, you think to yourself, well, how could she possibly have bought into this? But it happens countless times between these different kinds of schemes. And so I thought that was an interesting crossover between Sweet Bobby and the kind of coercive control that was going on there and some of these other phenomena. And
it's interesting, actually, if we had more time, I'd come back to Matt, because when we worked, Matt, are you still there? I don't know whether Matt's around, let me just see. But we worked, Karen, when we did a series of pieces about anti-vax. Hey, Matt, do you remember we talked about this around anti-vax, QAnon, and the relationship, particularly quite organized? What was it again?
Well, I mean, there's all conspiracy theories in the digital world and world of network politics are interconnected because they have in common a suspicion of establishments of all sorts, and of course big pharma and government are seen as being this the same thing. But it's very what's fascinating about QAnon is how multivalent it's become. For example, infiltrating the wellness industry, which Charles Peel has a new film on, but also very much in touch with the anti-vax sort of tropes, because they mesh very well online, and everything is about data and the acquisition of followers. And if you reach out from one conspiracy theory to another, you can snag millions of people simply by linking one message to another. The urtext for all conspiracy theories is anti-Semitism, and that's always the model.
Don't you think, but don't you think we've got? There's a job here, and Karen, there feels like there's somehow something happening in the last couple of years that leads to a much more coordinated libertarianism. We were talking about this yesterday in one of our meetings, the relationship between COVID anti-vax, excessive encroachment of the state, crypto. I guess wellness is part of that, isn't it? Take control rather than, big pharma. There's something here over, I don't know, Matt, whether you've got a view on whether or not there's a particular individual, organization, network that's a way of telling that, but there's something.
Well, I mean, of course, the genius of this is that there is no SMERSH. There's no HQ. And the quest for, there are individuals like the Mercers and Bannon and so on who've been very active, and rightly they've been, we've drawn attention to them. But it's the nature that there are many spiders on the web. The interesting thing I think about this, and the scary thing, which goes back to what Giles and you were discussing at the beginning, is that what binds all this together, and indeed you can see echoes of Brexit in it, is the idea that people no longer feel they have agency in traditional politics. So what conspiracy theories appeal to is that we're now governed by elites who are completely impermeable to change, to accountability, to displacement, and that the various parties on offer are all the same. They're all corrupt. They're all utterly detached from the interests of real people. And that's the story that underpins every single one of these conspiracy theories, whatever it is. It's libertarian in the sense that it seeks to dislodge you from any control of the state, but it's not old-fashioned neoliberal capitalism. It's much more dramatic than that. It's the idea that we have to totally go off grid, totally dissociate ourselves from these so-called elites that are controlling us, and to which we have no means of changing. And if you don't, if the evidence doesn't suggest that, you just argue that the elite is holding on to power illegitimately, as in America, where a terrifying number of people believe that the Biden victory was not legitimate. It's that, to which to me is the most extraordinary element of the whole story.
Well, on that note, let's end on two sort of political agendas. Ella Hill, I think, or at least hope, you're going to kind of fill us in tomorrow morning on where those congressional committees and January the 6th has got to a year on. Give us it in summary. Are you there?
Hi. Yes. So in summary, I'd say that they are doing the work. They've had thousands and thousands of pages of documents submitted. They have done interviews with 300 witnesses. They've had announcements of those 50 subpoenas. We still haven't got to an idea of when they're going to be having those hearings yet, but they want to be having them. I'm sorry, I've just got to move. James has got some interviews, so I've got to move out of his way. Yeah, so we haven't got to a point where we know exactly what the dates on that is going to be, but and when we're going to be having our, what did the president know and when did he know it moment. But we will get there hopefully by they want to have sort of finished off the process by the spring of 22, which a lot of people saying is kind of ambitious given the huge scope. There are 5 different prongs of the investigation looking at all aspects. So it could be longer.
Being there, firstly, sorry to interrupt you, just settling in, Ella, but just being there, is your read on the whole thing that it's cathartic, but ultimately probably doesn't change anything? Oh, I lost you there for a second.
Did again. I think so. I think that I need to sort of probably get a bit more bedded into it to sort of work out. I really think that sort of feeling of catharsis will probably come with those hearings. So at the moment, it's a lot of people. I think, as Giles said, that there's been quite a lot of almost fretting, I guess. But the point of actually having this aired in public and talking about it in those chambers will be the big test of what the general feeling will be.
Well, Ella, thank you. I'm going to last one. I'm going to come to Emily Benn, head of the sports section, or at least her own.
My own sports section.
One woman Olympic committee.
Yeah.
So Emily, do us 2 things if you would. One, what Labour does in 2022 to get back in the game, and 2, under what pretext you get to go to China for the Olympics.
Well, given that the British government is boycotting China, maybe I should just offer to go as the official
as this country's representative.
What does Keir Starmer need to do? It needs to become relevant, really. I mean, it leads in polls, and even in just for a brief period of time as best prime minister for a while. That's not been quite a long time since Labour had a leader that was ahead on best prime minister. Really quite a long time. But it's to Matt's earlier points and comments about Johnson being safe because of COVID. It's very difficult for Labour to become relevant during COVID, because what do you do? And it tries to draw dividing lines, like saying the government's not doing enough, but doesn't have its own plan C, really. So it's trying to walk some kind of difficult political line. You know, Keir Starmer makes a big speech in, big in inverted commas yesterday. I'd like to pay attention to the Labour Party. I didn't really hear too much about it myself, so that says something. So relevance is key. Charisma, one might say, is kind of needed for Keir Starmer. It's hard to know if you can get that at his stage of a life, let alone political career, but I think it's going to be difficult. I mean, Labour's probably not going to fight the next election against Boris Johnson anyway, so it's not like it's a straight matchup, but it's got, and I say this every single time, so apologies if people have heard it before, but it's bloody difficult for the Labour Party to properly win a general election. It hasn't happened very often. Only one person in the last 50 years has managed it, even though they did it 3 times. So it's difficult to be relevant. And unless you tell me that the Scottish political domestic situation is going to change a lot, which I don't think we all... Yeah, I mean, it's got to be a bit more exciting. Labour likes talking to itself, and while it does that, it doesn't stay relevant. So that would be my take for what it's worth.
And Emily the Eagle, is there anything that we should watch out for in terms of the Winter Olympics?
The thing that I'm most upset about is that there's a Ghanaian skeleton. That's going down moved on a tea tray.
Yes.
He's just tested positive for COVID, so I'm not sure if he was going to be able to qualify, because he would be my major one. But for any Team GB super fans like myself, it just always watch the curling, because we're, thanks to Scotland, very, very good at it. And there are some fabulous biathletes, some cross-country skiing. We do very well in snowboarding. We had such an amazing medal haul 5 years ago, so there's lots to look out for Team GB.
And also, your sleeplessness is obviously something just to watch.
This is not ideal for the time zone issue, as I discovered in Tokyo while doing a full-time job and staying up all night. But I have to admit, my knowledge of the Winter Olympics is not as good as it should be. But it's the Olympics, and even if however many countries are boycotting it, the athletes at least will have a chance to.
Yeah. All right. Well, Emily, thank you. Listen, I'm obviously out of practice, or perhaps you'd say not, because I always run over anyway. But I've gone over a few minutes. Apologies for that. There are a number of people who I didn't get a chance to hear from. It's very nice to see Anushka and see Daniel and see William and a whole bunch of others. I hope we'll see and hear more of you. As I said, Ray Dalio is joining tomorrow night. We're going to be talking about his book and the Changing World Order. It's pretty fundamental around debt, money, inflation is the first piece of it. The second is inequality and civil war, and the third is the battle between the US and China. So quite a fair bit to get into tomorrow evening at 6:30. But for this evening, thank you very much. I know that we touched on a great deal. Our sense at the moment is that we are limbering up for a year where there is quite a huge amount to cover, and figuring out how best to do that with your help is what we're here to do. So thank you for making the time to join us. Look forward to seeing you, I hope, tomorrow evening. And once again, a very healthy and happy new year. Have a good evening.